ReactJS is a front-end JavaScript library developed by Facebook in 2011. It follows component-based approach and it got open sourced in 2015. React is one of the most famous JavaScript libraries and hence in demand. A lot of organizations are using React, which ultimately increases the job opportunities. So today we are here to help you out with React Interview. Hello everyone, I'm Anika from Edureka. Welcome you all to the session on ReactJS Interview Questions. Before starting the video, let me address the agenda of today's session. I will begin with discussing about ReactJS, where I will show you the demand of React, the job opportunities, and salary trends for React developers. Then we will move ahead with the frequently asked questions and answers in ReactJS interviews for different roles. And before wrapping up the session, I will discuss about the skills required to become a ReactJS developer. Now let's begin without further ado. Starting with the demand of ReactJS, a lot of big organizations including Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, Pinterest, Airbnb, LinkedIn, etc. are using React. Talking about the numbers, 74,31,098 and more live websites are using React. 31.3% of the world's specialists are utilizing React. And you can check on GitHub, there are 170k stars for React right now. Now, let's have a look at the job opportunities. So, there are more than 43,000 jobs available on LinkedIn alone in India for React. As compared to 2019, there has been 184% of increase in the openings for ReactJS developers in the year 2020. According to India Today, a Quest report states, after COVID-19, ReactJS developer is one of the top digital skill jobs in demand. Talking about the salary trends, the current average salary for the roles of React domain is 735k, which includes the average salary of 597k for front-end developer or engineer, the average salary of 654k for software engineer, and the average salary of 1 million for senior software engineer. With all this information, let's move to interview questions and answers. I will discuss the questions on 4 topics of React, which are being frequently asked in React interviews. The topics covered today are ReactJS Basics or the general React, then ReactJS Components, then we have ReactJS Redux, and ReactJS Router. Now starting with the general React questions. So the first or the basic question on React is, what is ReactJS? To answer this question, I would say ReactJS is an open source front-end JavaScript library which is used to build user interfaces and handle view layer for web and mobile applications. It follows a component-based approach. The React package contains only the functionality necessary to define React components, and it is typically used together with a React renderer like React DOM for the web or React Native for the native environment. Now here, when I talk about component-based approach, so everything in ReactJS is a component. So what happens is, these components can be reused. They can be placed wherever required. So we can just write it once and use it anywhere and anytime. Now, even though React was open sourced only in 2015, it has one of the largest communities supporting it. Moving to the second question, that is, what are the features of ReactJS? To answer this question, I would say, the major 3 features of ReactJS because of which ReactJS is known are virtual DOM, server-side rendering, and unidirectional data flow or data binding. So talking about the virtual DOM, that is actually the virtual data object model. A virtual DOM is a lightweight JavaScript object which originally is just a copy of the real DOM. It is a node tree that lists the elements, their attributes, and content as objects and their properties. React's render function creates a node tree out of the React components. It then updates this tree in response to the mutations in the data model, which is caused by various actions done by the user or by the system. Talking about the server-side rendering, when I say server-side rendering, which means using a server to generate HTML from JS modules in response to a URL request. That's in contrast to client-side rendering, which uses the browser to create HTML using the DOM. Server-side rendering with JS or React works similarly to other server-side languages. Now, when I say unidirectional data flow, data binding, so in React, data flows in a single direction, that is from parent components to child components. which helps in data binding, and it makes the application and the code predictable and more debuggable. Moving ahead with the next question, which asks, list some of the major advantages of React. Talking about the advantages of React, so it increases the application's performance. It can be conveniently used on the client as well as server side. Because of JSX, code's readability increases, and React is easy to integrate with other frameworks like Meteor, Angular, etc. And using React, writing UI test cases becomes extremely easy. Now let's move ahead to the next question, which asks, what are the limitations of React? Talking about the limitations of React, React is just a library, not a full-blown framework, and its library is very large and takes time to understand. It can be a little difficult for the novice programmers to understand, and coding gets a little complex as it uses inline templating and JSX. Now the next question is, what is JSX? So JSX is basically shorthand for JavaScript XML. This is a type of file used by React which utilizes the expressiveness of JavaScript along with HTML-like template syntax. This makes the HTML file really easy to understand, and this file makes applications robust and boosts its performance. Now let's see the next question, which is, what do you understand by virtual DOM? Explain its working. So as we have discussed in a previous question also about virtual DOM, a virtual DOM is a lightweight JavaScript object which is just the copy of the real DOM. It is a node tree that lists the elements, their attributes and content as objects and their properties. React's render function creates a node tree out of the React components. It then updates this tree in response to the mutations in the data model, which is caused by various actions done by user or by the system. And this virtual DOM works in 3 simple steps, which are, whenever any underlying data changes, the entire UI is re-rendered in virtual DOM representation. Then the difference between the previous DOM representation and the new one is calculated. And once the calculations are done, the real DOM will be updated only with the things that have actually changed. So here, a kind of patchwork is done, as you can see in the picture also. Moving ahead with the next question, that is, differentiate between real DOM and virtual DOM. When we compare real DOM and virtual DOM, we find the differences like real DOM updates slow while virtual DOM updates faster. Real DOM can directly update HTML while virtual DOM can't directly update HTML. Real DOM creates a new DOM if element updates, while virtual DOM updates the JSX if element updates. So that's why real DOM is comparatively slower than the virtual DOM, because in real DOM, every time any element gets updated, a new DOM is created. While with React, which uses virtual DOM, whenever any element gets updated, only the JSX part gets updated. Now, the next difference is DOM manipulation is very expensive in real DOM because every time you have to create the new DOM, while DOM manipulation in React, that is virtual DOM, is very easy. And real DOM results into too much of memory wastage, while virtual DOM results in no memory wastage at all. The reason we know, because every time new DOM is created whenever any element gets updated, while with the help of virtual DOM in React, only the JSX part gets updated with the update in any element. Now moving to the next question, which asks, why can't browsers read JSX? Browsers can only read JavaScript objects, but JSX is not a regular JavaScript object. Thus, to enable a browser to read JSX, first we need to transform JSX file into a JavaScript object using JSX transformers like Babel and then pass it to the browser. Now let's move ahead with the next question. That is, what is JSX transform? As browsers don't support JSX, the compilers like Babel or TypeScript are used to transform JSX into regular JavaScript object, which is understood by the browsers, as we have seen in the previous question. Now, JSX transform automatically compiles the JSX source code without having to rely upon the typical compilers. With the new transform, JSX can be used without importing React, and according to the setup, its compiled output slightly improves the bundle size as well. Now let's see the answer for the next question, which is how React syntax changed from ES5 to ES6. So as you can see on the screen, the code snippet for ES5 and ES6. So in ES5, we use React.create class and which we initialize in a variable. For example, here we have taken my component. But in ES6, we just make use of classes and we make use of extends keyword, and the syntax is class, the name of the component, my component, or the class, my component, extends react.component. So the major difference between ES6 and ES5 is in ES5, we make use of create class, while in ES6, we make use of react.component. Now let's move ahead with the next question. That is how errors are handled in React. So talking about the error handling in React, the most distinctive and React specific type of error handling is what is known as error boundaries. So error boundaries are React components that catch JavaScript errors anywhere in their child component tree, log those errors, and display a fallback UI instead of the component tree that crashed. Error boundaries catch errors during rendering, in lifecycle methods, and in constructors of the whole tree below them. Now let's see the next question. That is, what are the limitations of error boundaries in React? So talking about the limitations of error boundaries do not catch errors for event handlers, asynchronous code that is set a timeout, or request animation frame callbacks, for server-side rendering, and errors thrown in the error boundary itself rather than its children. Now let's see the next question. That is, what are the features introduced in ES7? So ECMA script 2016 or ES7 introduced two new features that are array.prototype.includes function, and the second one is exponentiation operator. Talking about array.prototype.includes function, so it checks the array for the value passed as an argument. It returns true if the array contains the value, otherwise it returns false. Earlier, we needed to use array.prototype.indexOf function to check if the given array contains an element or not. Talking about exponentiation operator, so ECMA script 2016 or ES7 introduced the exponentiation operator, that is double asterisk. It has the same purpose as math.power function. It returns the first argument raised to the power of the second argument. Moving to the next question, which asks, list some of the features of ES10. So this is the latest version of ECMA script. So the features introduced in ES10 include optional catch binding, object.fromEntries, array.flat function, array.flatMap function, dynamic import, global this object. Now the next question is, how is React different from Angular? So talking about the differences between React and Angular, we see on the basis of architecture, React is only the view of MVC, that is model view controller, while Angular is complete framework for MVC, that is model view and controller. Talking about the rendering, so React supports server-side rendering, while Angular supports client-side rendering. Talking about the DOM, that is data object model. So as we have seen earlier also, React uses virtual DOM, and we have seen the advantages of using virtual DOM, while Angular uses the real DOM. Talking about the data binding, React uses one-way data binding or the unidirectional data flow, while Angular has two-way data binding or the bidirectional data flow. Talking about the debugging, React supports compile time debugging, while Angular supports runtime debugging. And talking about the author or who owns React and Angular, so React is owned by Facebook, while the author of Angular is Google. With this, we have seen some of the frequently asked questions and answers based on general React. Now moving ahead, let's see the questions based on ReactJS components. So starting with the first question based on ReactJS components, what do you understand from in React everything is a component? To answer this question, I would say components are the building blocks of a React application's UI. So everything in React is a component. And these components split up the entire UI into small, independent, and reusable pieces. Then it renders each of these components independent of each other without affecting the rest of the UI. And these components can be JavaScript functions, which takes in arbitrary inputs and returns HTML representation. Now let's see the next question, which asks, what is the purpose of render function in React, or explain the purpose of render function in React? To answer this question, I would say each React component must have a render function mandatorily. It returns a single React element, which is the representation of the native DOM component. If more than one HTML element needs to be rendered, then they must be grouped together inside one enclosing tag such as form, group, div, etc. This function must be kept pure, that is, it must return the same result each time it is invoked. Moving to the next question, that is, how can you embed two components into one? So as you can see on the screen, we have one code snippet. We have embedded two components with the help of class, then the component name or the class name, then using the keyword extends, and we made the use of react.component. With this syntax, as you can see on the screen, we are embedding two components into one. So there are two components, the my component and header component. Moving to the next question that asks, what are props in React? So props is basically the shorthand for properties in React. They are read-only components which must be kept pure, that is immutable, and they are always passed down from the parent to the child components throughout the application. A child component can never send a prop back to the parent component, and this helps in maintaining the unidirectional data flow or the data binding, and are generally used to render the dynamically generated data. Moving to the next question, what is a state in React and how it is used? Talking about the states, so states are the heart of React components. States are the source of data and must be kept as simple as possible. Basically, states are the objects which determine components' rendering and behavior. They are mutable unlike the props and create dynamic and interactive components, and they are accessed via this .state function. Moving to the next question, which is differentiate between state and props. So while comparing state and props, we find the differences like in state and prop, both receive initial value from parent component. While in state, parent component cannot change value, while with the help of prop, parent component can change the value. And we can set default values inside the components, both in state as well as in props. In state, we can make changes inside the component, but with props, we cannot make the changes inside the component. And we can set initial values for child components in both state as well as in props. But changes inside the child components cannot be made in state, while in prop, we can make the changes inside child components. Now moving to the next question, which asks, how can you update state of a component? Now here you can see a code snippet. So basically the answer for this question is, we can change the state or we can update the state of a component by making the use of this .setState function. And as you can see on the code snippet as well, earlier here name was Max and ID was 101. Then again in render function, we'll make use of setState, basically this .setState function, and inside that we can change the value or we can update the state of the component. So here we are making the change in the value. As you can see over here, we are updating it to Jahia and ID to 222. Now moving to the next question, that is, should we update the state directly? So to answer this question, we should not update the state directly. And why we should not update the state directly? Because if we update the state directly, calling the setState function afterward may just replace the update we made. And when we directly update the state, it does not change this .state immediately. Instead, it creates a pending state transition, and accessing it after calling this method will only return the present value, and we will lose control of the state across all the components. So that's why we should not update the state directly. Moving to the next question, that is, what is arrow function and how it is used? Arrow functions are more of brief syntax for writing the function expression. They are also called fat arrow, the functions. It is symbolized with equal to and greater than symbol. Now these functions allow to bind the context of the components properly, since in ES6 auto binding is not available by default. And arrow functions are mostly useful while working with the higher order functions or HOFs. As you can see in the picture as well, without arrow function and with arrow function. Without arrow function, we were making use of this .handle change .bind. While with arrow function, we have just made use of this symbol that is equal to and greater than, and then we made use of this dot handle on change. No need for bind and all. Now moving to the next question, that is, how do you reference a DOM element? It is a pretty simple question, and answer to this question is also very simple and crisp. That is, an object this dot refs, that is this dot refs, which is found as an instance inside the component, can be used to access DOM elements in ReactJS. Now moving to the next question, that is, what is the use of e.persist function? Answer of this question is nothing. ePersist function does nothing because e.persist function was used in event pooling, but with React 17, event pooling has been completely removed. But this e.persist function is still available on the React event object, but now it doesn't do anything. Now moving to the next question, which asks, what do you mean by event pooling? As we have seen in the previous question, that event pooling has been removed from React 17, but we should know what is event pooling because this question has been frequently asked in interviews. So the synthetic event objects were pooled. This means that the synthetic event object would be reused and all properties would be nullified after the event handler has been called. Now, for example, you can see the code snippets available here. So earlier, when event pooling was supported in React, the first snippet, as you can see over here, this would not work because the event object gets reused. But with the help of e.persist function, this code works because it prevents React from resetting its properties. But this is the case before React 17. Now event pooling is not supported by React. Now moving to the next question, what are React hooks? So React hooks are functions that let us hook into React state and lifecycle features from a functional component. So what is this hook into? Actually, these functions let us use the React state and lifecycle features from a functional component. And React hooks cannot be used in class components. They let us write components without the class. Now moving to the next question, when and why hooks were introduced in React? React hooks were introduced in the 16.8 version of React or React 16.8. Earlier, functional components were called stateless components and only class components were used for state management and lifecycle methods. The need to change a functional component to a class component whenever state management or lifecycle methods were to be used led to the development of hooks. Now moving to the next question, that is, do you know any of the techniques to optimize React app performance? So there are many techniques to optimize React app performance, but some of them are using useMemo function, using React.PureComponent, and maintaining state collocation. So when I say using useMemo function, so it is a React hook that is used for caching CPU expensive functions. Sometimes in a React app, a CPU expensive function gets called repeatedly due to re-renders of a component, which can lead to slow rendering. Now, this useMemo function hook can be used to cache such functions. By using useMemo, the CPU expensive function gets called only when it is needed. Talking about using React.PureComponent, so it is a base component class that checks the state and props of a component to know whether the component should be updated. Instead of using the simple React.Component, we can use React.PureComponent to reduce the re-renders of a component unnecessarily. And ultimately, it optimizes the application's performance. And when I say maintaining state collocation, so this is the process of moving the state as close to where we need it as possible. Sometimes in React application, we have a lot of unnecessary states inside the parent component, which makes the code less readable and harder to maintain. Not to forget, having many states inside a single component leads to unnecessary re-renders for the component, and it is better to shift states which are less valuable to the parent component to a separate component. Now moving to the next question, what is lazy loading? Lazy loading is the feature introduced in React version 16.6, which allows for some components to load later than the other components. This way we can load the components which are fast like text earlier and the components which load later like images later. It is also referred to as code splitting and data fetching. Moving to the next question, what is a fragment in React? A common pattern in React is for a component to return multiple elements. But fragments let us group a list of children without adding extra nodes to the DOM. While rendering multiple elements will require a div tag around the content, as the render method will only render a single root node inside it at a time. So in React 16.2, fragments were introduced, and we use them instead of extra div tags and all. So as you can see in the code snippet available on the screen, in place of using div tag, we are just making use of react.fragment. And inside this, you can see this child A, child B, child C. These are basically the elements. Now moving to the next question, which asks, what is setState function? So setState function allows us to change state in a React class component. As we have seen in a previous question, we were making use of this .setState function, right? And the setState function enqueues change to the component state and tell React that this component and its children need to be re-rendered with the updated state. This is the primary method you should use to update the UI. And setState does not always update the component immediately. Instead, it may defer the update until later for better performance. And the syntax for this function, as we have seen in the previous question also, here, setState, and in the braces we can give the updater or the callback. We can pass it as the argument. Moving to the next question, that is, what is useState function? So the useState function is a React hook that allows to have a state variables in functional components. The useState hook is a special function that takes the initial state as an argument and returns an array of 2 entries. Moving to the next question, what do you mean by context in React? So the React Context API is a way for a React app to effectively produce global variables that can be passed around. This is the alternative to prop drilling or moving props from grandparent to child to parent and so on. A new type of context can be created using React.createContext API, and this context API is added in version 16.3 of React that allows one to share state across the entire application or part of it lightly with ease. Moving to the next question, what do you mean by prop drilling? So prop drilling can be defined as a process in React application where props are passed from one part of a tree to another by going through other parts that do not need the data but only help in passing it through the tree. And it is also known as prop threading. Now I give it over to Mr. Ashok to take you through the more questions on React Components, React Redux, and React Router.
What are the differences between stateful and stateless components? This table is showing the differences. So stateful components are those which stores information about component state change in memory. Stateless are they calculate the internal state of the components. Stateful components, they have authority to change their state. As the name suggests, stateless components cannot have authority. They do not have authority to change their state. If I talk about stateful component, they contains the knowledge of past, current, and possible future changes in state. Stateless components, they contains no knowledge of past, current, and possible future state changes. Stateless components notifies them about the requirement of the state change. Then they send down the props to them. In a stateless component, if I talk about, they receive the props from the stateful components and treat them as callback functions. So this table is very important. It's a very general question again asked nowadays in ReactJS interviews, that what is the difference between stateful and stateless components. Now, what are the different phases of React component lifecycle? In a very interesting one. So as we all know that there are 4 phases. So here I'm depicting the 3 phases and the initial phase which are mostly used. The updating phase, one is the mounting phase, another one is the unmounting phase. We can amalgamate the 2 in one. So now it becomes 3. So initial phase, updating phase, and unmounting phase. As you can see on the screen, every phase is having their own methods which are working in a particular order or this particular priorities. So initial phase is having the function as get default props, get initial state, component will mount, render, and component did mount. If I talk about updating phase, these are the methods or functions available in the updating phase. Again, it is at render. If I talk about the unmounting phase, so unmounting phase has a function called components will unmount. So these are the various lifecycle methods, I will say. These are called the lifecycle methods in ReactJS, which we need to have so that whatever props or components we are using, they get mounted and unmounted accordingly. Now, explain the lifecycle methods of React components in detail. If I talk about the lifecycle methods which we just saw in the previous slide, that what are the lifecycle methods in React. So these are the various methods which we generally use. Component will mount. It gets executed just before the rendering both on client and server side. Component did mount. It is executed after first render only on the client side. The other one is component will receive props. It is invoked as soon as the props are received from parent class before another render is called. The other method or the lifecycle method is should component update. It returns true or false value based on certain conditions. If you want your component to update, return true, else return false. By default, its value is false. Component will update. It is called just before rendering takes place. Component did update. And the other one is component will unmount. This is called after the component is unmounted from the DOM. It is used to clear up the memory spaces. So all these are the lifecycle methods which are used in ReactJS. Now, what is an event in React? Events are triggered reactions, or I will say actions, to specific actions like mouse over, mouse click, key press, etc. React events are similar to HTML JavaScript events. So for example, in this example or in this diagram, as you can see, this is a bulb. There is an action called switch on. If someone clicks on, the bulb is getting on. So this is kind of a event which is getting triggered, which are reactions to specific actions. How we can create events in React.js. So as you can see here, this is a render function, class display extends react.component in a ES6 class standard of writing the code. Here I am using a render function which is returning a div, and on click is the event. That is how we can create the events in React.js. This.show click me. What are synthetic events in React.js? Synthetic events are the cross-browser wrappers around the browser's native event system. They combine the browser behavior into one API, and they are done to ensure events have consistent properties across different browsers. So if we want to have our React.js application running on different browsers, we will use synthetic events in React.js. Now, what do you understand by refs, which are references in React.js? So refs stands for references. So they are used to return references to a particular element or component returned by render. They are basically useful when we need DOM measurements or to add methods to the components. List some of the cases when you should use refs. So first of all, they are used to manage focus, text selection, or media playback. For triggering imperative animations, just like as you can see on the screen, if you want to display this kind of animation, imperative animation, we will use refs in React.js. And if you want to integrate with third-party DOM libraries, that is also where we use refs in React.js. How do you modularize code in React? So we can modularize code by using the export and import standards, or by using export and import properties. We can write the components separately in different files. So for one file, we will use the export property, and for another file, we can use the import property. That is how you can modularize the React.js code. And as you can see on the screen, the two code snippets for, or two files, I'll say, for export and import properties. How forms are created in React? This is again a very basic interview question with respect to React.js. So HTML form elements maintain their own state in regular DOM and update themselves based on user input. However, in React.js, state is contained in the state property of the component, and it gets only updated via setState, as we all know. So JavaScript function is used for handling the form submission. What do you know about controlled and uncontrolled components? So as I mentioned earlier, components are of two types: presentational components and container components. Again, there are two other types of components which are controlled and uncontrolled. So controlled components are those which do not maintain their own state. The state is not maintained in control components. Data is controlled by parent component, not by the child components. The control components takes in current value through props and notifies changes via callbacks. If I talk about uncontrolled components, they maintain their own state. Data is controlled by DOM, and refs are used to get their current values. So if you want to use refs, we need to have uncontrolled components. Now, what are HOC? When I say HOC, these are high order components. So these are the custom components, I will say, which we developed while doing programming in ReactJS. So these are the custom components which wraps another component. They accept dynamically provided child components. Then they do not modify the input component. They do not copy any behavior from the input component. And I'll say that these are the pure functions. So basically, they are the custom components which are developed to add on functionality to some other components. These are called HOCs. So what can you do with HOC? HOC means high order components. You can reuse the code, logic, and bootstrap abstraction using HOCs. We can render hijacking, state abstraction, manipulations, and also we can also do state and props manipulations with HOC, high order components. Now, what are pure components? Pure components are the simplest, fastest components which we can write. These are very fast. They can replace any component that only has render. Enhances the simplicity and performance of the application. These are the pure components. As you can see here, there is a code snippet react dom.render h1 hello document.getElementById content. So these are the two parameters which needs to be passed to the render function. And this is the simple component, I will say simplest component, or I can say the pure components which we can write in ReactJS, and hence the performance, and I will say it is the fastest in ReactJS. Now, what is the significance of keys in ReactJS, or what is the significance of keys in React? It is used to identify unique virtual DOM elements with their corresponding data driving the UI. So as we all know, there is a key value pair combination always in every programming language. So just like that, we have keys in ReactJS, which is used to identify the virtual DOM elements. And what are the virtual DOM elements with respect to their driving UI? This we can know using keys in ReactJS. They must be unique number or a string. They helps React to optimize rendering by recycling existing DOM elements. So instead of re-rendering with keys, React just reorders the element. So if you don't want to re-render your UI, or if you don't want to re-render your components, you can just reorder the elements using keys in ReactJS. And obviously with all these things, the performance of the application gets optimized and highly increased in ReactJS. So that was all about the second section of the React interview question. Let's move forward, and now I will talk about the interview questions related to React Redux. This is a combination of React and Redux technology. So what were the major problems with MVC framework? Basically, we all know it's a model view controller. So what is the major problem? So DOM manipulation is very expensive because MVC framework is completely based on DOM and not on virtual DOM, just like in ReactJS. It's slow and inefficient. And there is a lot of memory wastage in MVC framework. Because of circular dependency, complicated model was created around models and views. So these are some of the drawbacks or problems with MVC framework. Now Flux. Before Redux, there was a technology called Flux, which was introduced by Facebook. So what was Flux? Architectural pattern that enforces unidirectional data flow. So there on the screen, as you can see, there is an action, then dispatcher, store, and view. So architectural pattern that enforces unidirectional data flow. Controls derived data and enables communication between multiple components. Now, as you can see, there is a central store which has authority for all the data. Any update in data must occur here only. So store is the central or the heart for all React Redux or Flux application. It provides stability to the application and it reduces runtime errors. What is Redux? Redux is one of the hottest library, I will say, for front-end development. It is very, very famous. You can also check how much it is famous and its popularity on GitHub sites, that it has more number of stars and more number of watches as compared to Flux. It's a predictable state container for JavaScript apps. It is mostly used for state management applications where state needs to be managed. Applications developed with Redux are easy to test, and it helps to write applications that behave consistently and can run in different environments. What are the three principles that Redux follows? First is the single source of truth, that is the store. Single source of truth, and when I say, I'm talking about here the single store. There is only one store in a Redux or a React Redux application. State is read-only in Redux. The changes are made with pure functions. You can make changes only with the pure functions in Redux libraries. What do you understand by single source of truth? When I say single source of truth, It is the store which I'm talking about in Redux application. Redux uses a store for storing all the application state at one place. Whatever the state happening or state changes happening in a React Redux application, it will be notified to store or will happen in conjunction with the store. So components state is stored in the store and they receive updates from the store itself. So whatever the components, so these are the various components. So the state of all these components will be stored in a single place, which is called store. And any update needs to happen or needs to be there, that will be received from the store itself. The single state tree makes it easier because it's a single state tree, makes it easier to keep track of the changes over time and debug or inspect the application. What are the various components of Redux? First one is the action, which is an object that describes what happened. Reducer, it is a place to determine how the state will change. But I will say the reducers are the pure functions, which says how it needs to be done. As I said, action, that what needs to be done. Reducer, how it needs to be done is given by the reducers because these are the pure functions. Store, as we saw just now in the previous slide, that store, it's a single source of truth. There needs to be a single store which is used for state management of all the components. So a state object tree of the entire application is saved in the store. View is to simply displays the data provided by the store. Show how the data flows through Redux. Again, a very interesting question, that how we should know that how data is flowing through Redux. So as you can see here, that these are the container components, which is passing data as the props. They are passing the data to actions. Action is passing the data to reducer. So the input for the store is the reducer, and reducer is again giving the data to the provider component, or you can say the view part of it. So that is how the data flows in Redux applications. How actions are defined in Redux. Always remember that action should have a type property that indicates the type of action which needs to be performed. So type is very important for every action. So let's say in this code snippet, as you can see on the screen, there is a function called add_to, which is taking the input parameter as text. Is what it is returning is, it is a type, and this what type of action it is, add_to. So they must be defined as a string constant, and we can add more properties to it. That is not a problem with the action. You can add as many properties as you want, but the most mandatory part or the most important part for an action is it needs to have a type property, and actions are created using functions called action creators. The other question which we have is, what is the role of reducers? Reducers are the pure functions which specify how the application state changes in response to an action. It takes in the previous state and an action and returns the new state. So what is the work of a reducer? Basically, it takes the previous state, make the changes, and it returns the new state. It determines what sort of update needs to be done based on the type of action and returns the new values. It returns the previous state if no work needs to be done. If there are no changes in the state or if there are no updates, obviously it will return the previous state which it takes as an input, and as an output it returns a new state with the changed parameters. What is the significance of a store in Redux? Store, as we all know now, that store is the single source of truth. It's a JavaScript object. Holds the application state. It maintains the application, or I can say it maintains the state tree of the particular application. That is the store. Provides a helper methods to access the state, dispatch action, and register listeners. With store, the data state can be synchronized from the server level to the client layer without much hassle. And since it's a single store, it's a single source of truth, it's a single place to maintain the state tree of the application, it makes the development of the large application very easy and fast. How Redux is different from Flux. So these are the basic differences between Flux and Redux. If I talk about Flux, the store contains state and change logic. It has multiple stores, flat disconnected stores. In Flux, all the stores are disconnected. Singleton dispatcher, React components subscribe to the store. In Flux, state is mutable, so you can change the state in Flux. If I talk about Redux, store and change logic are separate. We have a single store in Redux. Single store with hierarchical reducers. You can have multiple reducers in Redux, but the store needs to be single in React Redux application. So if I talk about the container components, they utilize connect, and state is immutable. This is again very important, that the state is immutable in React Redux application. What are the advantages of Redux? So I've listed down some of the advantages of Redux: predictability, maintainability. The application will be very fast. It will be optimized. We have many developer tools. The testing and debugging part will be easy, and huge open source community for Redux is available out there on internet, and precise organization of code, because there is only one store which is maintaining the complete state of the application. So these are some of the advantages of Redux, which makes React Redux application very famous and very popular.
And the next question in React Redux is, what is Redux Thunk? So Redux Thunk is a middleware that lets call action creators that return a function instead of an action object. That function receives the store's dispatch method, which is then used to dispatch regular synchronous actions inside the body of the function once the asynchronous operations have completed. And the thunk can be used to delay the dispatch of an action or to dispatch only if a certain condition is met. And basically it sits between action creator and reducer in the React Redux flow.
Now moving to the last part or the last section of this webinar, that is the React Router interview questions. So what is React Router? It's a very powerful routing library, I'll say. It helps in adding new screens and flows to the application. It keeps the URL in sync with data that is being displayed on the web page, and it is a very simple API. The React Router APIs are very simple to use. Why switch keyword is used in React Router version 4? The switch keyword is used when you want to display only a single route to be rendered among several defined routes. So as you can see here, if I want to have multiple defined routes, but I want to display only a single route, then I use the switch statement. Why do we need a router in React? So router helps in defining multiple routes inside the router, with each route leading to a unique view. As you can see on the screen, there are multiple React routers. For example, these are the 3 routers, and each router is leading or representing, I will say, a unique view. So that is why we need a router in React. List down the advantages of React Router. So there are various advantages of React Router. The API is very simple, and the API is all about component. The API is component based. The router APIs, it can be visualized as a single root component. No need to manually set history value. It has separate packages for web and native platforms. That's why it's very famous. How React Router is different from conventional routing of data. So again, there is a table of the differences based on the various topics. Pages involved. Each view corresponds to a new file. In React Router, only single HTML page is involved. In conventional routing, we used to have multiple pages involved in application. If I talk about the URL changes, in conventional routing, HTTP request is sent to the server and corresponding HTML page is received. In React Router, only the history attribute is changed. This is a very drastic change in the request response terminologies. If I talk about the look and feel, user actually navigates across different pages for each view in conventional routing. But for React Router, user is duped thinking he's navigating across different pages, but it is actually not the case.
Now the next question is, why is switch keyword used in React Router v5 or version 5? Although a div tag is used to encapsulate multiple routes inside the router, the switch keyword is used when we want to display only a single route to be rendered amongst the several defined routes. The switch tag, when in use, matches the typed URL with the defined routes in sequential order. When the first match is found, it renders the specified value and thereby bypassing the remaining routes. As we have seen some of the frequently asked questions and answers in React interviews, now let's have a look on the requirements or the skills required to become a ReactJS developer. So to become a ReactJS developer, you should have the following skills, which include fundamentals of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, fundamentals of ReactJS, which includes JSX, ES6, hooks, Node plus NPM, and Redux. With this, we have come to the end of this video. Hope it was useful for you and you have enjoyed it. Do not forget to like the video and subscribe the channel, and go rock your interview. Thank you. Happy learning.